Hello and welcome. My name is Anne Marie Pierce, President of the Community Foundation of Mississauga, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's vital conversation. These are extraordinary times, and it's important to have conversations with a COVID lens. This is the first of a four-part Vital Conversation series in COVID-19 times, and today we present the Regional Grantmakers discussion. The COVID-19 pandemic has placed pressures on our society and across our community. The not-for-profit sector has had to pivot and adjust to new ways of program delivery to our community's most vulnerable people. There was tremendous response from levels of government, and funders provided support so our community needs could be served. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to take a brief opportunity to thank our corporate partners whose support means so much to the Community Foundation. Kaiser Mason Ball, Asante Wealth Management, MNP, Mississauga Board of Trade, Bayshore Home Health, Lakeside Controls, Farnham Accountants, and Pallet Fallow. Your continued partnership supports our vital work in the community. Today we have an incredible panel from granting organizations, and I look forward to some thoughtful discussion. Allow me to introduce your moderator, Paula Harvey. Paula is a member of the Community Leadership Committee and will guide us through today's session. I'll ask Paula to provide a bit of background on herself and our panelists. Paula, please take it away.
Dynamite. Thank you, Anne Marie. So it is my pleasure and I'm delighted to act as today's moderator. I'm a proud resident and community member of the City of Mississauga with 20 years of career experience in local community health and within the developmental sector. I've had the privilege of working alongside dozens of non-for-profit agencies and funders, implementing creative solutions and strategizing supports towards meeting the needs of our community's most vulnerable. My current employer is Bayshore Home Health, where I am engaged as a corporate partner with the Community Foundation of Mississauga, as well as a volunteer with its Community Leadership Committee. The engagement and purpose of our dynamic committee is to promote community dialogue, build partnerships, and work on issues of broad interest. I welcome you all today to do just that. As today's moderator, I look forward to drawing from the emerging conversation as it relates to the regional grantmakers and how we continue to navigate and secure success as we move forward within this unprecedented and challenging period. Charities have always been creative with their funding resources and management. Given the sudden urgency caused by the COVID-19 global pandemic, it has become vital to communicate and brainstorm within the community with the end goal of supporting those most in need. Therefore, today's event was created with a special highlight on speakers who are thought leaders among the philanthropic scene. Today, we will explore how grantmakers, our panelists, responded to the crisis in creative ways, overcame their hurdles, and share the lessons learned. I hope to prompt and engage a dialogue that explores how our recent collective experiences may shape grant-making and charitable activities for years to come. The purpose today is not to target personal questions as it relates to unique support requests that you or your agency may have applied to. Rather, we are looking to reflect on the response actions made, where we are now, and how we best mobilize our next steps. With respect to housekeeping, note that everybody in the audience will be muted, so please use the icons to share an expression such as clapping hands if you are giving the thumbs up to a comment or a reference that's shared. To elevate questions to the panelists, please enter using the chat, noting that if time is restricted, we may not be able to elevate your question to the panelists, but I will do my best to ensure that they are followed through or at least passed along to the panelists following the conversation. I'd like to note that today's session will be recorded for future reference and viewing on the Community Foundation of Mississauga website, so stay tuned for access at a later date. I'm thrilled to introduce today's panelists, each a community cultivator and a recognized thought leader on the topic at hand. Following each intro, I'll invite the panelists to share 2 minutes or so of commentary as it relates to their agency and organization's response during the pandemic. So we'll kick things off with Ruth. I'll introduce you, Ruth. I don't see you, but I know you're there. Ruth Crammond is the Vice President of Community Investment and Development with responsibility for a broad range of United Way investments and agency partnerships in community services, in addition to place-based work within the Building Strong Neighborhoods strategy. Ruth joined the United Way in 2014 as the Director of Community Services and Capacity Building, overseeing the transformation to a new investment model for United Way for the largest portion of United Way investments in the community. Ruth has numerous years of experience working in the community services sector in Toronto, beginning her career with United Way through funded agencies, working as a summer camp counselor at Central Neighborhood House and as a drop-in worker in a program for people who are homeless at St. Christopher's House. Ruth has held several senior management roles within United Way funded agencies, including the Executive Director at the Davenport Perth Neighbourhood Centre and the Director of Housing at Shelters at YWCA Toronto. Welcome, Ruth. Please share some brief highlights, Ruth, of how the pandemic has affected you and your work at the United Way.
Thank you so much, Paula, and thank you, Anne-Marie, for inviting me here today. I think we have been working in a coordinated way with our funding partners like never before, and I've really appreciated the chance to work with Anne-Marie and team on this federal granting that we've recently rolled out. So I would say, and I see some friends on the call, it's nice to see you. You know, funders, I think, have the same experience that you on the ground were having as agencies. You know, when we first heard at the end of March, when we first started realizing how incredibly serious this was going to be, and that we realized things were closing up. In the early days, it was so confusing. There was so much information. I know all of you, or everybody was emailing back and forth. There were phone calls. Nobody knew what was happening. What should we do? Should we open? Should we close? What's happening? What are our local governments doing? What, you know, what's public health saying? So I think what we found is initially we realized our role was not just about funding. It was also about helping with the coordination of services, and all of you on the ground were amazing at shifting so quickly, jumping into action, you know, closing up, say, food banks and shifting them to delivery models and this amazing work. But each agency was so busy on the ground that the coordination was really tough, and people were calling us to say what's happening, what are other people doing. So we right away joined with the region of Peel, with our Lean-In team, the Peel Crisis Response Table, so that we were following everything that was happening on the ground and seeing in real time, getting the information from the agencies, from all of you. And then we jumped into action with our local Love Fund. So we learned a lot about rapid response grant making, which we have not done as much of at United Way, but we raised money from donors and we put it right back out into community. I'm hoping many of your organizations were able to access that fund. It was not only for agencies previously United Way funded. We funded a lot of new agencies as well, just small grants, $10,000 to help people enable remotely, maybe give cell phones to their clients, distribute needed food. So, and that kind of grant making was different for us. Sometimes agencies tried once and didn't get it. We sent it back to them, they tried again, and they applied again because it was like a rolling intake as long as we had enough money. So that was a different way for us to grant make, and we learned a lot through that, a lot also about what you needed. And then we partnered with the federal government, which is where I started to work with Anne-Marie on distributing federal funding. We put about $2.7 million out to projects in Peel, about 35 of them in Mississauga. And again, 60% of the grant recipients were not previously United Way funded agencies. So I think through lots of outreach, working with networks and partnerships and other funders, we were able to get the word out to lots of organizations that had not previously worked with United Way, as well as those who had already been funded by United Way, who were able to get that one-time federal emergency money. So what else did we learn? We did a lot of capacity building sessions. Agencies wanted help with how to apply for the wage subsidy, you know, technical issues, HR issues, as you all know, like what do we owe our employees? Well, how should we be handling this? How do we keep people safe? So we realized we had a role there. So I really think, and the other last thing I'd like to say is we really saw the critical role of the community services sector and how incredibly fast it was able to pivot and move and respond. And so we felt that the sector was leading and we needed to support and follow and help coordinate.
Dynamite. Thank you so much, Ruth. Wow, lots of information and lots of change, lots of amazing new challenge that was worked through. Next, I'd like to introduce Arlene. Arlene Coventry-Bauer is the Manager of Community Capacity and Investment at the Region of Peel and draws upon more than 20 years of experience in health, community development, mental health and addictions, and social housing. Arlene has extensive experience in partnership frameworks, fund modeling, program design, integration, and transformation to support marginalized populations. Arlene currently leads 2 multidisciplinary teams in the Human Services Division at the region. The first is the Community Investment Program, which provides funding investments to support a strong and sustainable Peel non-for-profit sector that meets the needs of residents and advances community impact. In 2019, the Community Investment Program provided $6.9 million of funding to the non-for-profit sector in Peel, supporting core infrastructure, improved business practices, organizational development, and collaborative partnerships. Arlene also leads the Community Intelligence and Capacity team, a team that plans, models, and analyzes financial performance and interprets population-level data to provide insight on trends and community needs to recommend upstream systems change that to address complex social challenges in marginalized and equity-seeking populations within Peel. Arlene's team uses evidence-based best practices and established performance metrics to inform program planning and business improvement decisions. Welcome, Arlene. Please share your bird's eye view of how the pandemic has impacted your teams at the Region of Peel.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it. I have to just ditto a lot of what Ruth said. I mean, COVID-19 and the pandemic really made everybody pivot and become agile. And I would say at the Region of Peel, I really thought about how we quickly, with United Way and other major partners, the speed of which we put together a regional community response table. We convened it very early in the early days. And we really started to try to understand as well as look at the immediate impact that COVID was having on the Peel sector. Our table represented more than 90 community agencies, not-for-profits. We have health leaders, we have local municipalities, foundations, and many traditional and non-traditional community builders. The community response team provides still today an opportunity to actively listen and work with Peel's not-for-profit sector to advocate, respond quickly with needed solutions. And the table right now focuses on communicating public health guidelines, best practices, policies. We look at bridging silos between traditional and non-traditional partnerships. We have United Way, Greater Toronto, against school boards, police, foundations. We convene diverse Peel partners to problem solve pertinent issues, whether it's around food insecurity, systemic discrimination, isolated seniors, and even domestic violence. We're coordinating urgent resources that were definitely needed in the immediate stages, where we looked at the funding needs of the Peel sector, the volunteers, the distribution of PPE. We're connecting and targeting Peel communities in need to serve the most vulnerable, and we're really collectively discussing common outcomes and support and planning, operations and service delivery. We're also trying to inject a little bit of an evaluation to make decision-based evidenced decisions, so that if, like we see, we are in the second wave, that we can go back, have lessons learned, be agile, we can adapt to the changes, and then amplify to move forward, so that we can really work together on what we need to immediately see what we need. So whether it's poverty, whether it's social isolation for seniors, It's so essential. And I would again say really working, I would say the collaboration of all the funders and all the partners with the region, we really couldn't have been able to move quickly. We were early adopters for funding right in early March. We went to council, we received $1 million before federal and provincial dollars. But again, it truly was the community and hearing what the needs were for us to move forward.
Thank you, Arlene. Wow, and I love that you're really stepping back to review and reflect, because there are lessons learned that we really need to use as we move forward into this next stage, right? Thank you so much. So Anne-Marie, you're next. It's my pleasure to introduce you. Anne-Marie Pierce is the not-for-profit leader who has spent more than 25 years in fundraising and advancement with a passion for ensuring that organizations can successfully achieve their mission. She has honed her craft in roles in healthcare, philanthropy, and post-secondary education. Anne-Marie presently serves as the president and CEO of the Community Foundation of Mississauga, an endowment-based organization and one of 192 across Canada. The Community Foundation ensures the long-term vitality of the community by investing funds through donor support and providing important grants to organizations across Mississauga each and every year. Anne-Marie has also worked as the Chief Development Officer at Mohawk College Foundation, providing leadership to a successful capital campaign and a vibrant development team. Prior appointments also include Executive Director at King's College Foundation at Western University, Director of Major and Planned Gift Giving at Grand River Hospital Foundation, and roles at University of Waterloo and McMaster. Welcome, Anne-Marie. Please share your comments from a high level as to how the pandemic has affected the Community Foundation of Mississauga. So you're muted. Check, check. Pauline, can you please unmute Anne-Marie?
Got it. Thank you. I'll leave it unmuted. Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction. When I went home from work on March 17th, our communications and signage said that we would be back 3 weeks later on April 14th. We really didn't have a sense of the scale and scope of the pandemic that was unfolding before our very eyes. It was over those weeks that we would realize, that the world would realize that what had been befallen us. And it was starting to dawn on us that things would never really be the same again. With the passage of time, 6 months later, we gathered together today to reflect, and there's much we've learned and the ways in which we've changed. What I've learned is that we as a sector are resilient, we're innovative, we're resourceful, we're collaborative, and we can turn on a dime. The COVID pandemic hit when we were undergoing our 2020 grant round, and this year we were granting about $1 million. We continued with that round because we knew that with the lens of COVID, those monies were even more important than ever. But we also took the opportunity to establish our foundation's Mississauga Emergency Relief Fund so that we could fund charities whose operations were impacted by the pandemic. But at the same time, the federal government announced the Emergency Community Support Fund. And so after adjudicating our typical grant rounds, we got busy granting monies for emergency funding from both of those funds. As we look back at the opportunity to support organizations who provide services and programs for our community's most vulnerable, we have a sense of appreciation for the work that you do. Program guidelines, our program guidelines with the ECSF Fund contained a broad definition of vulnerable communities, and our grant supported agencies whose work supports people experiencing low income or living in poverty, persons experiencing homelessness, members of the LGBTQ2S+ communities, children and youth, persons with disabilities, older adults, people living with mental illness, and the list goes on. And a variety of needs were addressed through these grants, including food, health, hygiene, safety, social inclusion, learning, mental health and wellness, information, navigation, and transportation. And we saw a lot of requests and grants for web conferencing systems and computer equipment, as well as monies for enhanced cleaning, PPE, tenants' rights counseling, and a walk-in fridge, which we're very proud of. But what we learned and what we really appreciated about the opportunity to grant these monies is our collaboration with the United Way, as well as with the region of Peel. We collaborated with the United Way and were informed by the Peel's early grants to ensure that we had the broadest range possible, broadest range of grants possible. As we took time to reflect on the role that we played, it was one of gratitude gratitude for having the privilege of making a difference in our community when our citizens need it the most.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. So we're going to be jumping right into questions right now. There's a number of questions that have been collected from the community, from the non-for-profit sector, from charities, from donors, and that's sort of where we've based the opportunity to engage in further dialogue this morning. So I'm going to kick it off with the first question, and this is really for all panelists. Is there a moment when you experienced is there a moment that you experienced during your organization's response to the pandemic that will stay with you? Something that really resonated as a real game changer, something that really will never leave you. Ruth, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, well, there are probably quite a few, as there are for everybody on this call, both personally and professionally. But one that really hit me was when public health released guidelines that seniors over 70 should not be leaving their homes. And I remember just thinking, oh, you know, we have a community service sector that is, you know, pretty good and pretty strong, but is already overwhelmed with needs related to poverty and marginalized folks. And now we're going to add in even more people who are going to need different kinds of services. Maybe people who didn't previously need service, you know, seniors 70. I mean, there are a lot of pretty independent seniors at 70 years old who go out and do their groceries and do all kinds of things on their own. And I just thought, wow, like, you know, this tsunami is coming, and how are we going to reach people that might have not previously needed community services? So I think that was, of course, I thought about my own mom and mom-in-law, and but I thought about all the seniors out there in our communities. And we had a little example, and then I'll pass it over to panelists. We had a really interesting story come in from Find Help, which some of you, most of you might know, I hope, 211, where there had been a senior, an elderly lady that called a radio show in Vancouver because she was at home and she was hungry and she had no food. And somehow she was listening to a radio show in Vancouver, maybe a national show. She called in and said, how do I get food? And that the 211 in Vancouver called 211 Find Help that works in the GTA, and they got a seniors agency that delivered food to her door. And, you know, then there was this amazing story about she just couldn't believe people had found her and brought her food, but she had been sitting in her house for days with no food because she didn't want to go outside. So anyway, I think we've really mobilized trying to reach people, but I think that's going to be our continued struggle as a sector. How do we get the word out, and how do we let people know how to access the great services that you all have?
Agreed. Arlene, what are your comments around your unique experience and what really resonated with you?
I think for me, I remember in early March, we were moving along at the region and community investments with our plan. We were facilitating a rather large group for one of our grants. And I remember one of the leaders who was at the consultation stopping and saying that how serious all of a sudden that this was a world pandemic. And here we were going along, and we all stopped and reflected. There was about 30 of us in that room that day. And we were like, we weren't quite sure what we needed to do in the moment, but it was amazing to see all of these agency leadership and managers and caseworkers who were there to learn about funding, but pivoted for that specific point in time to say, okay, if this is a pandemic, how are we gonna help? What do you think we need to do? And those were early discussions that we started to have. And then the region immediately, as a collaborator and a convener, really reached out to, I know United Way reached out. We were convening and having discussions with the different cities. And I just remember thinking, wow, like what a great collective of people who want to help the most vulnerable. And, you know, the community response team table was definitively started, and it evolved. And I know that right away, even before the funding came into play, people were pivoting to help the most vulnerable. So whether it was around, can we help people around food insecurity? Where are those isolated seniors in Peel? It was so essential in that moment how organic everybody collectively came together. So, you know, really happy to be part of a community who really wants to rally and help the most vulnerable in their time of need, but also to collaborate and share with each other on how they're each doing. Because even with the foundations or United Way, we're quick to get together and help one another, whether it's the region funding one way and then complementing that funding through the foundations and the federal funding pots with the foundations as well as United Way is truly remarkable. So really happy to be part of this journey. Is it a difficult journey? Absolutely. But willing to get in there and really help out. So I'm you know, happy to be here.
Wonderful. All hands on deck, collaboration. That's what I'm hearing. Anne-Marie, do you have a brief comment?
Sure, I do. So at the Community Foundation of Mississauga, we had grants, you know, rapid grants of up to $5,000 and then up to $75,000. And, you know, what struck me was that no matter the size of the grant, the charities were really scrambling to find a way forward to serve the needs of their constituents. And, you know, we saw, you know, basic needs, food, shelter, housing, and other needs that were most frequently applied for. But the moment that's really going to stay with me was appreciating the effect of the pandemic had on stakeholders. You know, it's the loss of Wi-Fi. It's the loss of Wi-Fi. If you can imagine that you are in the community and your link to the outside world is through a public Wi-Fi, whether it be in a, you know, a Tim Hortons or, you know, or in a public library or things like that. And there are many who lost access immediately to that outside world. They were untethered. You know, it might be that they were, you know, receiving mental health counseling or daily check-ins with a counselor, touching base with a homeless shelter advisor. They may, you know, need to know, you know, where can I go? Where can I sleep tonight? Or a person facing increased violence, needing some advice. That was compelling for me.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question I have for the panelists, this one is actually targeted for Arlene. Many charities have faced serious revenue declines as they have had to cancel events and in-person fundraising. Tell us about the diversity in COVID-19 funding responses that you've seen. And you are muted. Pauline, can you please unmute Arlene?
Sorry about that. Isn't that the classic saying, right? Please unmute me. So I would say that the Region of Peel was an early adopter of funding for COVID-19. So through our community response table, we identified that funding was required immediately to support community agencies, meet the urgent needs of the most vulnerable in Peel. In March, we put out a pulse survey to over 90 agencies who participated in the table, and the sector and we identified that 79% of Peel not-for-profits and community agencies were facing immediate program closures. They were seeing decrease in revenues. They saw declines in fundraising, but there was a real increase in demand for support for vulnerable clients and the need to adapt services to an online platform to sustain continuity of programs and services. So on March 26th, the Regional Council approved $1 million in funding through the Community Investment Program, and we established the COVID-19 Emergency Fund. April 23rd, we moved quickly, and Regional Council again approved over $11 million of federal and provincial funding to support local needs. The region worked quickly to streamline applications. We wanted to have ease of use. In May and June, the immediate emergency fund, the $1 million, supported over 65 agencies for immediate impacts. The funding helped organizations increase critical staffing levels and adapt their service delivery models so that the most vulnerable have access to the necessities of life. Through the fund, the region was able to reach over 20% of new diverse organizations that we've never funded before. The funding was able to provide immediate sector support in food security, families and at-risk youth, multi-service agencies, women and domestic violence, housing and homelessness, disabilities, settlement, and volunteer services. Some examples of the funding that we provided was 4 to 6 weeks of funding to support up to 1,000 seniors with perishable and non-perishable food items and for families with seniors. The funding also supported 50 homeless clients with pandemic survival kits. This not only included non-perishable food items, but also hygiene kits, healthcare, and cleaning products. We also funded a lot of agencies who needed online software to connect to virtual learning programs. And one of the programs provided a learning platform for 534 at-risk youth. Also too, I would say, we really strengthened our existing relationships and intersections with funders like the Foundations and United Way, which are critical for the region of Peel. We worked with local municipalities, so the City of Mississauga, the Town of Caledon, and City of Brampton. We worked with the United Way Greater Toronto Partners, provincial and federal funders, foundations, to really help collectively respond to the different phases of the pandemic. We've activated and convened a COVID-19 Peel Funding Consortium. It's a previously established group, but we temporarily repurposed it to focus on the effects of the pandemic. Collectively, we work together to share best practices, key messaging, funding supports, urgent contingency planning, and discuss collective how best to support vulnerable populations during the many phases of the pandemic. Our main goal was to work together collectively and complement all the different funding for COVID-19, not duplicate. And a great example of our collective is we were able to put together a funding resource that was easy to use for all different types of organizations to find COVID-19 funding in this landscape.
Excellent. Thank you, Arlene. The next question is one for all of the panelists, and the charitable sector was hit hard very early as it scrambled to adjust so that they could continue to offer services. Talk to us about the role of technology in this transition. Is the future unlimited since people have taken to technology? Ruth?
So I'm going to start off the top with something positive, although I think and my other co-panelists I know are going to talk. Anne-Marie spoke about some of the concerns we have as we see this digital divide, growing digital divide, which is yet another kind of inequality that you know, people in the community are facing for sure. But on the positive side, I would say, in service delivery, we have learned that we can do some things differently. You know, this call is a great example of how quickly people can come together, connect across, you know, geography, you know, find ways to actually see and hear from and speak to each other in ways we haven't before. And we have seen how you all have shifted in some cases to technology, and I think in some ways we won't go back entirely. So not only our workforces, our own workforces, but also with some of our clients. I know, for example, that, you know, for clinical counseling, the idea of being, especially for young people, the idea of being able to triage and do a quick, you know, call, a Zoom call or something with somebody to assess, you know, where they should be referred to, how quickly they need to be taken into service, and even whether they could continue to receive some virtual counseling, has addressed some of the wait lists, particularly in the children and youth mental health sector, people who have been on wait lists for years. So, I'm sure we've all had the experience. I've certainly seen my family doctor remotely, And instead of having to take a whole afternoon off work, I was able to have a 15-minute phone call and get my questions answered. And I didn't then have to take time off work, which, you know, if I was an hourly, being paid on an hourly basis, would really make a big difference for me. So I think we're learning that we can be doing some things online. I heard a great story from Community Living. Oh, no, I'm sorry, CNIB, about how they were doing more virtual support groups, and how incredibly great it was for their clients, because they didn't then have to travel to the site with all of the challenges that poses for them, and how they could find people with like issues, you know, like demographics across the country to be able to get support from. So I think there have been lots of disadvantages, and we're all kind of aware of the limitations. Virtual counseling is not perfect, particularly, you know, in situations for seniors often don't like it. Domestic violence is very tricky, trying to provide support to people who are living in unsafe situations. So it's not to say that we should be pivoting all our services virtually, but I think we've learned there might be some things we could be doing virtually that would help us provide more effective services.
Thank you, Ruth. Anne-Marie?
Sure. I wanted to come at this from a different point of view, because technology has certainly affected charities, you know, in fundamental ways. But one way it's affected us in a very positive way is the granting. With millions of dollars to grant across Canada, Community Foundations of Canada provided an infrastructure that was front-facing to grant applications, and then had a huge behind-the-scenes segment that allowed the funders to receive, review, and track grants to our communities. And this was across Canada, so it was a pretty busy portal. But this gave me a perspective on what is the possible. Accessible applications that reduced the burden on our applicants and accelerated the pace of giving. It enabled the rapid review of applications, and it actually made the granting easier for us to put money into the hands of our community. And so on our front, I'll let you know, it's changed how we grant. So prior to the COVID, our plan was that this fall we would be piloting our electronic fund transfer, because we were actually still issuing checks to all of our agencies that received funding. And that was, 100 plus, checks every year. And sometimes people lost them or didn't cash them. Anyhow, but Community Foundations of Canada was very clever. They required the use of electronic fund transfer. After all, it was a rapid review and granting. And so in a sense, it was really, we piloted in our biggest grant round ever, the use of EFT, and it went beautifully. And so I wanted to say that, we, from an accessible point of view, almost no agencies could not accept an electronic funds transfer. So that technology worked beautifully for us, and really from granting perspective, the future is unlimited.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm going to jump to the next question. And this again is for all three panelists. I'll probably start off with you, Arlene. As charities mobilize to access grants, we know that all three of your organizations have had an overwhelming amount of grant requests. Talk about the difficulty in decision-making for these funds and its impacts on your granting in the future.
I would start off by saying how great the demand was for the immediate emergency funding. So we received over 87 applications for the $1 million funding that equaled out to over 4.9 million. So we had very little money to start with such a great demand. We really had to lean to our other funders in regards to frameworks, but we also leaned to the Community Investment Programs framework, which was well known in the region of Peel. And we utilized that to try to get out our funds rather quickly within a 2 to 3 week turnaround time. We had many applications from many different types of organizations that we had never funded before, so that was kind of exciting, but we had to make sure we were doing our due diligence. Also too, we had a lot of organizations who were doing a bit of mission drift because they really wanted to support the most vulnerable during the immediate phases of the pandemic. But we had, again, to review the eligibility and assessment frameworks to make sure that it was low risk. So again, our eligibility was, we had guiding principles set up. We had a 3-step decision-making process through assessment, through allocations and fund approvals. We also, again, leaned to the foundation, shared our lists of approved agencies to get as much intelligence as possible, not only from the funding lens, but, you know, we wanted to lend the ear to some of the, maybe some agencies we've never funded, but the United Way had funded before. So we did a lot of work with that, but it did pull at the heartstrings because we really wanted to be able to support everybody and be able to provide funding so that the agencies could mobilize.
Thank you, Arlene. So the next, actually, we haven't really had any questions emerge through the chat. If there's anyone in the audience that has a burning question, we welcome you to push it through so that it can be considered. And in the interim, the next question is targeted for Ruth. Get ready, Ruth. We understand that funding agencies like yourselves at the United Way strive to be inclusive and diversified in granting to the needs of your community. Through the pandemic of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter movement, inclusivity is at the forefront of all of our thoughts. Please share with us your process to make sure this happens and will continue to improve moving forward.
Thanks, Paula. Yeah, very critical issue for us. And we have had, pre-pandemic, we have tried to be very clear that our mission for granting and research and advocacy work is about addressing poverty. And we know that certain groups are more affected by poverty. We know that racialized people, and in particular, we're talking about these days about Black and Indigenous communities, but we also know other racialized populations and newcomers struggle more with poverty. We know people with disabilities struggle more with poverty. And we know that there are other groups who are marginalized and not able to participate fully in, in our cities and in our region. So the equity, the other piece that has been United Way's work since back in 2005 in Toronto, but we are seeing increasingly in Peel, in Mississauga, is geography. And that people in poverty are concentrating in particular neighborhoods and don't have access to services and resources in those neighborhoods, have greater transportation barriers, so that where you live and your background are starting to determine your opportunities for the future, which is what our research has been pointing out for a decade, more than a decade. But I think what we're trying to get better at is what I really learned, particularly through the pandemic, is the importance of outreach. So we already had some criteria around making sure, like, who are you serving? Anybody who's applied to us knows we always ask that. Who are you serving? How do you know what their needs are? And how do you tell us about the demographics of the folks that you're serving? So we had that sort of in our assessment tools already. But what we learned is you can't fund groups if you don't get their applications, or if they don't really understand how United Way works. So to Anne-Marie's point, a lot of people have said that it's hard to apply to United Way. Our online granting tools are difficult, and so during the pandemic, we went with SurveyMonkey for our as did the Community Foundation, trying to make the tools more accessible, but also doing a lot of outreach. We worked with some of our board members who have great links into the Muslim community. We met with those communities. We worked with the NAPC, the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, that works across the GTA. We worked with the Toronto Aboriginal Services Council. So we worked a lot through networks trying to get the word out, and we found then that great applications came in. And in the emergency community support funding, for example, 65% of applications were for BIPOC groups and targeted to those groups. We had 60% of the applications we funded were for people with disabilities. You know, some of those are overlapping. So we found that through some of those processes, I think we did a better job at getting out to some of the grassroots organizations that have great tentacles out into the community. So I think going forward, that's going to be, that kind of outreach will continue to be critical for us. But also, I think the other thing we're getting better at, and you've already, United Way had done it in Peel already with the region, is asking all of you who apply to us and who get money from us to tell us really well who you're serving, so we can see who's missing and who isn't getting access to service. So we'll need your continued partnership in that exercise.
Amazing. Thank you, Ruth. Now a question for Anne-Marie. The unprecedented nature of the COVID-19 pandemic forced many organizations across the country to quickly respond. The past funding focus for charities has often been growth, but now many of us are trying to recover. Do you see emergency or recovery continuing into 2021?
So first, thank you for the question. First, I'd like to reference publication by Community Foundations of Canada. Community foundations across the country are known for their emergency response in the face of crisis. And so much so that the Community Foundations of Canada has put out guidance in its When Disaster Strikes guide. And it outlines the stages of response, recovery, and rebuilding. And it's this guide that I turned to when I wanted to make sense of the pandemic and where we are and, you know, how are we moving forward. Just a little bit about each of these phases. I mean, the response phase is at the time of disaster to 1 month after. The recovery is, and that occurs when the community is in a state of emergency and urgent needs must be met in a timely manner to preserve life and ensure major and essential services such as food, shelter, communication, etc. are available. Recovery can be anywhere from 1 to 12 months after a disaster. And this is by the Community Foundation's definition, by the way, and may not play out in a global pandemic, but for guidance, the recovery stages, the needs of community are met and the focus is now on finding ways for the community to recover from the disaster. And the rebuilding phase can take place from anywhere from 12 months to 10 years after a disaster. And it's in that phase that the community is stabilizing and shifts from immediate relief needs to long-term recovery. Recovery pathways are going to look different for every organization. And there may be times when recovery starts and stops, and you're going to go through the phases again. Some organizations may still be in closure mode, others may be in partial operations, and others and moving to gradually recovery, and still those who are back to full-on operations. But for each of the circumstances that charities may find themselves in, the concepts are different. Concepts are different, and we must consider things like, you know, continuing board meetings. You have to fulfill your governance functions, a comprehensive health and safety plan to protect not only your staff but your clients and your volunteers, etc. Access program demands for increased or decreased assessing your programs for increased or decreased offerings. You know, do you have more of a demand or in fact, do you have less of a demand for some of your programs? We've talked about alternate means of program delivery. Communication with stakeholders is absolutely essential. And plans for staff or volunteers serving the needs of your stakeholders. So you may have had modifications where your volunteers have had to really step up to the plate, but as you shift back to normal operations, what are the plans for and what model are you using to bring your staff back online? And of course, beyond that is your business model and your funding, et cetera. But layer on top of these considerations, the fact that Premier Doug Ford announced yesterday that Ontario is now entering the second wave of the pandemic. it's unclear at this stage what this may look like for many of our organizations. And so given this, it's not really clear cut. I believe that some are in recovery and many are still in response mode. Funders are continuing to play a key role in supporting charities. And whether you are government funded or subsidized or donation based, funders will need to play a role in COVID related recovery and rebuilding for many years to come.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I keep looking at the clock because I need to continue to be mindful of the timeline that we have here, because we are getting into the last leg of this morning's amazing discussion. The next question is for Arlene. Arlene, can you just sort of try and summarize? I'll share the question openly with the audience, but if you could try and just keep it to a couple of high-level points. I know that's a big ask based on how much content you have to share. Beyond our region, grantors have been pivoting to ensure essential funding for charities. Have you seen any response to COVID-19 that you would like our audience to know about?
I would say, just quickly high level, just the traditional and non-traditional funders working together. So I think that through federal and provincial funding streams, as well as regional and United Way and foundation responses, I would say that the real collaboration between some of the private, I would say, run agencies that are trying to step in and assist with the most vulnerable. So I would say that intersection is great, especially with the different types of organizations, whether they're arts organizations, sports organizations. I think, again, that intersection definitely is helping to fund an agency, not only in their immediate need, but throughout the different phases and the business and funding needs that they have.
Mm-hmm. And I hear there's some really good news on the Emergency Community Support Fund front. Ruth and Anne-Marie, would you care to comment?
Yeah, we've had news, as is Anne-Marie, that we will be distributing another round of Emergency Community Support Fund. So I encourage all of you, it will go live on our website on October the 5th. And I believe it's the same date for the community foundations. You know, I think Anne-Marie and I would encourage you to apply to both if you're not sure where to apply, which one to apply to, and we will continue to coordinate at our end. I know we'll be looking for some of the same kinds of things we looked for last time. We won't have as much money this time. Last time, United Way Greater Toronto distributed 15 million across the GTA, and this time we have 5 million to distribute. So it's much smaller call. But it can be to expand something you did in the first time, or it could be to do something new, or if you didn't get funded the first time, you can apply for funding. United Way is really going to encourage coordinated applications or collaborative applications. Doesn't mean you have to deliver everything together, but what we're finding now is there's lots of initiatives out on the ground. What we're worried about is how everyone is complementing one another. As I said, you don't have to be delivering the service together, but an understanding of what you might be providing and how that fits in with the overall service system. You know, we don't want one senior getting 5 meals a day and another senior not getting any food at all, for example.
Fair.
And just to follow up, the Community Foundation of Mississauga, as well as our partners to the north, the Brampton and Caledon Community Foundation, have also received funding as part of this program. Our funding is $560,000, and as Ruth mentioned, like the parameters are the same. It's really emergency funding for the most vulnerable in our community. And the hallmark of our last tranche of funding will be the same this time, and that is collaboration. We worked really closely with the United Way and with the Brampton and Caledon Community Foundation to ensure that those funds just go the furthest they possibly can and that there's no duplication. And that really is something that we're going to be working very hard on, because we know that these monies are very precious, and we want to put the monies into the hands of our community when they need it the most.
Thank you, Anne Marie. So we do have sort of a wrap-up question that's been prepared for the panelists. And again, we are super tight for time, and I do want to share one of the questions, or two quick questions that came from the floor. So if each of the panelists could give 2 points as to what truly excites and concerns you most about the future with respect to your agencies, funding availability, resources. 2 major points from each of you, that would be fantastic. Arlene?
I would just say that innovation is key in this time of uncertainty. Decision making can be accelerated and barriers can be removed, but at the same token, we can try to be as best we can more responsive to serve the people, the most vulnerable in Peel. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Arlene. Ruth?
Well, I'm just worried about the length of time that it's going on, and I appreciate all of your creativity, but of course now we're looking at possibly another year. So I know that's going to be hard on all of you and hard on the philanthropic sector. But on the great note, I think that the pandemic has really exposed the critical role of the community service sector that I think was invisible to many people in the public and to donors before. And I think this has shone a light on the work that you all do, which will make us our jobs easier in philanthropy. And I think that the role that this light on the work that you're doing can only be a good thing. So
thank you, Ruth. Anne Marie?
And for me, my concern is going forward are the financial challenges. We've seen charities that have a lot of financial challenges that have really critical work in our community. And my concern is that our times, they're going to continue and put pressure on charities, many of who are really finding it difficult to maintain funding levels. But what excites me the most is that this is a really transformative moment for the not-for-profit sector. We've seen an increased level of collaboration through the COVID-19 pandemic amongst organizations, and the ability of our sector to pivot and think outside the box is clear. It's never been more clear to me, at least. My best hope is that the continued innovation born of necessity will enhance your organization's ability to stay on mission, and that you'll find a way to keep this innovation spirit as you continue to serve.
Thank you, Anne Marie. Amazing. So we have to wrap up in 1 minute, but I know that there's this great sort of summarized theme amongst the questions that have been filtering through, and really it's from a very high level, and if we don't have time to answer them, we can just at least maybe pause and push something out following the meeting. Really the theme is around how is this year's experience impacting next year's business plan? So how do we move forward through all of this? And are funders going to be considering more long-term project funding? Because we are in this, it's seemingly, and affirmatively, for the longer term. Does anyone want to share a couple of points about their perspective?
Well, I think long-term, we need a strong network of agencies that can pivot and keep changing. I encourage you to keep evolving. We realize now that, you can't say what we used to, we'll just go back to what we used to do. You're going to have to, we all have to keep moving and changing. And I think it'll be important for agencies, in order to survive, to continue to demonstrate that they're able somehow to push through in this new environment and still address the critical needs that are out there. So, I know you can all do it.
Thank you, Ruth.
And I'll answer the other question just briefly, very briefly, and that is, how is this year's experience impacting next year's business plans? Well, many agencies and organizations are still trying to get their feet under them from this year's pandemic, let alone next year, but really planning has to start now. You have to figure out, where are your opportunities for funding? We know that many types of fundraising have really paused because face-to-face and other things aren't able to move forward. But what I would say, is that there are donors, there's a trend right now of donors, philanthropists who are focusing on local philanthropy as they see the impact of the pandemic on communities. And so what I would offer is that be ready to talk to your supporters about what this has meant and how you've responded. And this will help you in strengthening your case for support, and be ready to talk about this and your response, how you're moving forward and what the needs are. And really that will help and give you an advantage in the long run for funding.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I know in our previous discussions, one of the main points that I drew from this and in preparing for this is the requirement to really be solutions focused. Identify who you are, who you're serving, and what is your plan to meet and deliver to meet that unique need or that area of vacancy. And so thank you all for such an amazing, rich discussion and conversation. Thank you so much to the audience. If everyone has the chance, maybe you could throw up a reaction about, you know, what you thought about this opportunity of connecting virtually. This is the first Vital conversation that's been done virtually. So wonderful. And I'm on the wrong page. Forgive me. Thank you again, Arlene, Ruth, and Anne-Marie, for your thoughtful remarks and contributions today. I'd also like to say thank you so much to all of the attendees for your attention, consideration, and active participation. Please be sure to register for our next Vital conversation, Vital Charities, which will be hosted on October 27th here on Zoom once again. Our moderator for the session is Gurpreet Malhotra. And thank you so much, everybody, and I wish you a wonderful day. Thank you.